Carl Krause, the General Manager of WFDU FM.
Folks, how about a hand for everybody? Thank you, Judy. I'm going to take but a moment to sort of officially welcome everyone. I also want to acknowledge a couple people who are here who are very important to us. First, the Korzinskis. The Korzinski family has supported our radio station for over 20 years. Paul and Michael Korzinski are here from that family, and we appreciate their friendship and support. I also want to acknowledge our friend Bob Mann, Professor Bob Mann from Caldwell College, and his students who he has encouraged to come and be with us today. And I certainly hope that it's worth your while, and we expect you to ask questions. And of course, Jennifer Lair from Fairleigh Dickinson University and her students. Jennifer, come on, stand up. Jennifer has the unenviable task during graduation of pronouncing the most impronounceable names in the world, but she does a magnificent job of it, and we appreciate her talent. I want to call Barry Sheffield up to say just a few words.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, everybody on the panel. It's a great honor to be here tonight. 40 years at WFDU. I was here when they threw the switch in 1971, and often people will say, wow, I can't believe it's been that long and that I've been here that long. But it actually is a good story to tell, and I've been honored to be here. It's been a lot of fun. It's been the best job I've ever had. And one of the things that's made it very nice is the fact that University President, FDU University President, Dr. Michael Adams, has been an incredible supporter of this radio station. He has always been with us every step of the way, supporting us. We're radio men, right, Carl? That's what he always told us. And he's not here with us tonight, but we wish him well and let him know that he'll have a copy of the video of this event to look at his leisure. And I thank you all for coming here tonight. 40 years.
Good afternoon, or maybe good evening, and thank you all for coming out in this fairly inclement weather. I'm glad you all made it safely. Welcome to the panel discussion. It is called How the American Public Develops a Worldwide View Through the Consumption of Mainstream Media. It's a mouthful. It is an exciting part of the WFDU FM's 40th anniversary year. I'm Judy DeAngelis, and I will be serving as your moderator. The format tonight will consist of a presentation by each of our esteemed panel members, followed by some interaction among them, and then we would like to open up the floor for any questions you might have. And I would also like to note that today's presentation is being recorded for FDU-FM's archives and for future broadcast. So let's start out with what is the mainstream media. Look it up in Wikipedia. The definition refers to those media disseminated via the largest distribution channels, which therefore represent what the majority of media consumers are likely to encounter. It also says those media are generally reflective of the prevailing currents of thought, influence, or activity. Okay, that's all well and good. But it's the second paragraph in Wikipedia that may hold a little more truth to what the mainstream media really is. Wikipedia notes, recent concentration of media ownership has raised concerns about a homogenization of viewpoints presented to news consumers. Now read between the lines, and you'll see that the news presentation isn't necessarily crafted to inform, but to influence. Thus, the term media bias has joined the lexicon, as has the term the lamestream media. Well, there's plenty to talk about. I don't need to be doing it. And sitting before you are three very qualified speakers. Michael Aron, the Chief Political Correspondent for NJTV and Vice President for News and Public Affairs for the Foundation for New Jersey Public Broadcasting. Dan Cassino, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fairleigh Dickinson University and author of Consuming Politics, Jon Stewart, Branding and Youth Vote in America. Our featured speaker is Dave Marish, who has had his finger on the pulse of news for 50 years. He's held down anchor seats, he's been a correspondent, analyst, he's even been a play-by-play man in local network and global TV and radio. Our first speaker is Dan Cassino. I'm going to tell you a little something about him before he begins. After earning his PhD from Stony Brook University in 2005, Dan did his postdoctoral work at Princeton before coming to Fairleigh Dickinson University in 2006. Lucky for Fairleigh Dickinson. In addition to his work as an assistant professor of political science, he is also currently at work on a research methods text. His articles have appeared in Political Psychology, American Politics Research, and the Oxford Handbook of Political Communication. His research focuses on the psychological processes of underlying how individuals think about politics. And Dan is also part of PublicMind. You've probably heard of it. It is a research center right here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. It conducts polling, survey, and other research on politics, society, popular culture, and consumer and economic trends. From presidential and New Jersey gubernatorial, Senate, and state legislative races to homeland security and environmental attitudes, PublicMind has plumbed the public mind. And in addition, it created the New Jersey Index of Consumer Performance and Index of Consumer Intentions. It also hosts workshops for public officials on survey design, methodology, and analysis. Dan's latest work with PublicMind involves a specially commissioned poll by the university's polling unit on the usage of mainstream media. So please welcome Dan Cassino.
Thank you very much, Judy. I appreciate it. So I want to talk a little about the poll that we carried out, the study we carried out on what people actually know about news and what their media consumption, how their media consumption affects that. And in political science, it's something we don't do a whole lot. We simply don't like asking people very many questions about what they actually know about politics, because the results are uniformly depressing. If I go on a survey and I start asking people who the vice president is, I'm going to find out that less than half of Americans can name the vice president. Less than a third can name their representative in Congress. Less than 20% know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is. So Americans simply don't know very much about politics. And so as a political science, as a discipline, we stopped asking them because we don't want to be reminded of this. So what we did for this study is we actually went back and said, all right, let's actually ask these questions. But instead of asking these sort of civics type questions, what's a veto? Who's the vice president? We decided to ask questions about current affairs. After all, the CNN isn't going to tell you what a veto is, but they might spend 20 hours a day talking about Republican candidates for president. So we want to find out exactly how good a job the mainstream media is doing in informing people about the issues of the day. After all, politics, democracy, is all about leaders being responsive to the people on the issues of import. And if democracy is supposed to work, the people have to have some idea of what's going on. When we asked these questions, we were, as political science normally are, a little bit depressed with the results. We found, for instance, that if we asked questions about foreign affairs, we asked about the Arab Spring, we have found out that only about half of people in New Jersey knew if the Egyptians or the Syrians had been successful in overthrowing the governments in those countries over the spring. This is something that was all over the news in the spring and summer, and still, most Americans weren't quite sure what happened to those stories. All right, maybe people just don't pay attention to what's going on in parts of the world with countries they don't understand. So we asked about the Euro bailout, giant economic crisis affecting us a great deal. So we asked, well, if we have this Euro, if someone's bailing out Greece and other countries in Europe, who's actually doing that bailing out? We found that only about a third of the respondents knew it was Germany. Only a few less than that thought it was the US. About 25% said the US was the one actually doing the bailing out. Given how much our economic situation right now, this seems pretty unlikely. So we decided, all right, maybe it's just on foreign politics they don't know very much. So let's ask about domestic politics. We asked who's winning in the race for the Republican nomination for president. Time we ran the poll, it was Herman Cain was coming up right behind Mitt Romney. She said, all right, either of those answers will count as correct. And when we asked that question, only a little more than half of respondents knew that could name one of those two candidates as being the lead. Almost a modal group said, I don't know. Despite the fact we're spending so much time covering this information, people just aren't getting the basic facts. We also asked about Occupy Wall Street. We said, all right, these people occupying Wall Street, are they Republicans? Are they Democrats? What? And again, we found that most respondents didn't know that they were actually Democrats. All right, that in itself isn't too surprising. Americans don't know very much about what's going on. So what we did then was we looked at their media consumption. We asked them from a list of 13 different news sources, which of these news sources have you watched in the last week? And we were able to correlate that. We were able to find out what the effect of watching any of those media sources was on your actual knowledge of the news. Here's what we found. We found that on the question of Egypt, whether the Egyptians overthrew their governor or not, we found that if you watched NPR, you were a little more likely to know the correct answer. If you watched a Sunday morning talk show, you were a little more likely to know the correct answer. If you watched the most popular media sources we asked about, Fox News, you were 18 points less likely to be able to give us a correct answer. And these results hold almost across the board. The most positive media, the media that gives people the most information, that allows them to answer the questions best, controlling for all these other factors, party ID, education, other media sources they're watching, controlling for all those factors. It seems that watching Fox News or watching some of this other ideological media actually makes you worse at answering objective questions about what's going on in the world. So you're watching news and we find that you're actually know less, or actually less able as a citizen because of it. Moreover, the media sources that do the best job of informing the public, in our study it wound up being places like NPR, wound up being places like Sunday morning news talk shows, wound up being places like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart in some cases, are the ones that uniformly have the lowest ratings. Not only are Americans not learning from some of the media sources, but Americans are choosing to ingest the news from media sources that are teaching them the least, and in fact, in many cases, are actually leading them astray. Wow.
Well, that goes to what we were talking about before, and we'll bring it up again later. When does the news cease to inform and merely influence? Our next speaker is Michael Aron. As mentioned, Michael is the chief political correspondent for NJTV and vice president for news and public affairs for the Foundation for New Jersey Public Broadcasting. Now, previously, Michael spent 29 years as senior correspondent for New Jersey Network. He was news director for his final 3 years there. His background also includes print journalism, having worked at magazines like New Jersey Monthly, Rolling Stone, Harper's, and others. He is a native of Philadelphia. Michael attended Harvard College and did his graduate work at Princeton. His observations of and work with New Jersey citizens gives him a great insight into how Garden Staters use the media to view the world, not just here at home, but abroad as well. Please welcome Michael Aron.
Thank you, Judy. I want to thank my friend Carl Kraus of WFDU for inviting me here tonight, and say that I wake up every morning to the bluegrass music on WFDU by chance. So happy 40th anniversary. And before I get serious, I have to say that it's an honor to see Dave Marish for the second time in my life. I mean, I saw him on television many times, particularly when he was at Nightline. But I have to take 2 minutes to tell you the story of the first time I saw him. It's probably 1984. I had been at NJN for 2 years. I was hosting a talk show, among other things. A typical point-counterpoint kind of talk show. And Dave Marish was on local TV in New York blasting the New Jersey state government over toxic waste sites that were going unattended. So I had the brilliant idea of getting Dave Marish to come on with the Commissioner of Environmental Protection from the state, and Marish could defend his work and the Commissioner could defend his work. And to my delight, they both agreed. So they both came to Trenton on a Friday, and we did a show that was called Front Page New Jersey, and it was very good, very sharp disagreement. Dave Marish defended his work. Bob Huey, the then commissioner of DEP under Tom Kean, defended his department. And then the show ended. See you next week. The show ended, and one of them turned to the other and said, "You are full of it." And I think it was Huey who said to Marish, "You don't know what the hell you're talking about." And Marish said back something along the lines of, and you're lying to cover up your failures. Well, this started something really, really intense. And I, even though I was new to television, I said, "Keep the camera rolling, boys." It was a 25-minute program. They went at it for exactly 25 minutes. Do you remember this?
No.
Okay.
But ironically enough, Bob Weiner, who was the producer for Channel 4 on those stories,
is here,
who also ruined many pairs of shoes trekking around the Earl Arsenal and other dump sites south of there.
Well, it was so hot, this exchange, that I felt the audience would be gypped if they saw the program we taped initially. They really needed to see these two guys beating up on each other. So I called again, maybe that afternoon or the following Monday, and I said, "Can I have your permission to run the second confrontation?" And again, to my delight and surprise, they each said yes. And that was one of the hottest exchanges I ever officiated. Now, Dave Marish has had a pretty distinguished career in broadcast journalism, and most recently at Al Jazeera, which I wasn't really all that aware of until I read some material that Carl Kraus gave me, including an article that's pretty current in the Columbia Journalism Review that he wrote, in which he points out that, or he makes the assertion that video is now the universal language of the world, that it's replaced English or supplanted English, which I think he says has 1.8 billion speakers, but everybody has video on their device or in their home or wherever, regardless of what language they speak. And he bemoans the fact that news packages are diminishing on news programs and yielding more and more and more to talk. Do you all know what a package is? Does everybody understand that a package is when a reporter and cameraman or a producer and cameraman or three of them go out into the field, they shoot stuff and interviews, and they come back and they tell a story. Like a 60 Minutes is the ultimate package. But most news programs, particularly looking backwards, were one package after another. And Dave had access to some research, and it showed that these numbers, like Dan's numbers, are going in a pessimistic direction, that more and more it's the anchor just talking to the correspondent who never really has to leave the building, or it's interviews, or it's panels of experts, or he has a lot of numbers for a lot of different networks, but you know, if packages were 44% of the newscast 10 years ago, they're now 26%, that kind of thing. And this spoke to me because I'm living through this very same transition. As Judy said when she introduced me, I spent my entire broadcast career at NJN, I started in 1982. The day I started, they called me senior political correspondent. I'd never done a day's worth of work on a broadcast medium. And I was only 36 years old, but it sounded good, I guess. And then NJN went dark on July the 1st of this year as a result of, as the culmination of a decade's worth of debate over whether the state should be running and funding a public television station in this day and age. The governor felt that its time had come, that the state didn't belong in the broadcast business, and he convinced a very bare majority in the legislature to go along with him. And the place I worked for went out of business, 130 people laid off, and the franchise was awarded to WNET, Channel 13 in New York, which took it over and said, we will do more with less. Have you heard that line? We'll do more with less. And they are now doing a half-hour newscast with 20 people. We didn't have all 130 working on the half-hour newscast. We had about 35 people working on this half-hour newscast. Now they're doing a whole station with 20 people, where 130 did a whole station. And needless to say, the half-hour newscast consists of a lot of interviews. There aren't as many camera people, there aren't as many reporters, there aren't as many producers. Where I used to go out almost daily, often in Trenton at the State House, to shoot, come back to a headquarters screen, write and edit a 2 or 3 minute package, I now sit in front of a camera and chat with the anchor about what's going on. So Marish bemoans this trend. I'm living through this trend, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about why he thinks it's not the right way for journalism to go.
Thank you, Michael. And now, our featured speaker, Dave Marish, of whom I could sit here and talk about all night, but I will try and distill it down as best I can. Mr. Marish has logged 5 decades in the news business and has worn many, many hats. He's been at 2 major New York networks, CBS and ABC, and was most recently with Al Jazeera English in Washington, D.C. But Dave can talk about sports and science as easily as he can about politics and current events. He was host of ESPN's Baseball Tonight and NBC's Grandstand, and that traded off either as a National Football League pregame show or a sports anthology series, depending on what the season was holding. He also hosted a magazine-style show on science and technology during the early years of the Fox television network. Dave has earned kudos for his work. He's earned numerous awards, including Emmys for his coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing and the explosion of TWA Flight 800 for Nightline. Mr. Marish has some definite ideas on the current use or disuse of video in news gathering. And while I could spend a whole lot more time detailing his work, I would prefer you hear it from him himself. So it is great pleasure that I introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Dave Marish.
Thank you, Judy. And first off, let's give a shout out to WFDU on their anniversary. The thing about WFDU is that it always had a mission. And that mission was to bring as much of the world to its audience through music and culture as it could. And WFDU was diverse before diversity was mandated, much less cool. And its it's not your grandfather's diversity. It's always itching and scratching at the edges of culture and music and arts and theater to get what's new, to get what's changed, to get what's going on. Sticking to this mission was easy because it was only a leap of faith. That if you carried out your mission, there would be an audience. Turns out it's true that because WFDU has a defined personality, and that defined personality is diverse and widely outreaching, that it still reaches a remarkably large and diverse audience. Unfortunately, during my endless time on the scene, journalism, particularly television journalism, has lost its sense of mission. And even more importantly, has lost the confidence that if it actually stuck with its traditional mission, it would all work and turn out happily. When I first became a television news anchor at Channel 2 in 1972, or 73 actually, I was originally hired as the sports guy and then moved over to news. When I got there, I was immediately introduced to a news consultant who had come in from Iowa, from McHugh Hoffman, that and Magid were the two great news consultant organizations. And he had done enough research that he knew that I had an academic background, that I'd actually taught as a teaching assistant and guest lecturer at Rutgers and a couple of other, at Ramapo State and a couple of other schools. And he looked at me and he sort of narrowed his eyes to a suspicious scowl and said, "You know, Mr. Marish, you're going to have to make a choice." And I said, "And what would that be?" He says, "You can choose to educate or entertain." And his implication was clear. You're in the television news business, sucker. You better be entertaining. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, you just told me something really important about yourself." And he sort of jerked backwards like I'd slapped him. And he says, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, you told me that either you never went to school or you slept through class. Because if you had been in school and awake, you would know that good education is entertaining. And that, in fact, it's got to be. That education is a communication art. And scholarship without communication ain't education." So it's always been my belief that if news sticks to its mission, which is to give you the most accurate, the most transparent vision of what's there, what's real, that one, it will be faithfully serving a really high and important ambition, and the two, people will get it. That people actually like to be informed. And they particularly like to be informed by well-told stories. I mean, after all, what's sustained culture and civilization as long as man has been on the planet is storytelling. And so if you simply tell a story accurately and engagingly, clearly, directly, and memorably, as I like to say, that there will be an audience, and that the audience will be benefited and gratified. And of course, in the context of democratic politics, having an audience that wants to know, and is glad to know, and is ready to know, is probably the single most essential ingredient to the whole engine. A participating, informed citizenry is what democracy is all about. And so as television news has lost its dedication to what's there and replaced it to what'll keep the audience entertained, It's creating the kind of situation that has been epitomized for decades now by my friend Danny Schechter, the news dissector, one of the longest running and most entertaining media critics I know, who for decades has been saying the more you watch, the less you know. And now Dan and his colleagues are proving it, that this is not a joke, it's a social condition in the United States. When I was about 12 years old, something new came on the planet. It was a product called Cheese Whiz. It looked something like cheese, except that it was in what scientists, I guess, would call a semi-solid state. And it was sort of cheese that had been blasted with air and preservatives into this sort of foamy cheese-like substance. And it was sort of like cheese, but it wasn't cheese. And anybody who knew or cared about cheese, Cheese Whiz became the byword of fakery, of falseness, of an illegitimate substitution. Well, what's on America's television screens now is News Whiz. It's like news, but it's been pumped up with hot air. Its basic ingredients have been removed and been replaced by chemical substances. And to anybody who cares about news, it is as unsatisfying and unnourishing and probably as dangerous to your health as Cheese Whiz. And this is what we're inundated in today, is News Whiz. Michael mentioned the article that I did for Columbia Journalism Review, which was about how video reporting, a double concept, video meaning a camera on the scene, reporting meaning a reporter on the scene, gathering facts, making judgments, and telling a story. That video reporting is disappearing from American television news. Most dramatically, this was true at CNN. Now, I had an inkling of this when I was anchoring at Al Jazeera because, you know, you want to track the competition. And when it came to covering traditional news in 2006, when Al Jazeera went on the air, CNN was the most competitive product. So I would watch CNN. And it started to feel like to me that the periods between reports from the field was getting bigger and bigger, and that the proportion of the programming devoted to composed reporting was getting smaller and smaller. I had no idea. In writing this article, I went to the people who actually literally monitor and enumerate and calculate this stuff, the Project for Excellence in Journalism. And they told me that in the first quarter of 2007, 46% of CNN's programming was packaged reports on video from the field. By the first quarter of 2011, that had dropped to 18%. What had taken its place? Almost on a percentage point by percentage point basis, the answer was conversation. Now, there's a reason why they call it news. It's because it's always new. It's always changing. Yesterday in Afghanistan, in Kabul, was different from the day before yesterday and the week before that and the month before that. And in order to make any sense of today, of what's new, you've got to sort of know what's happened. And in order to do that, you've got to be there. Well, because they're no longer doing a lot of video reporting, there's no more of an imperative to actually send crews to the out-theres. Even if they're out-theres in which, like Afghanistan or Iraq, we have invested thousands of American lives and billions, now trillions of American dollars, still the number of live eyeballs out in Iraq, cameras in Iraq, reporting from Iraq, for most of the networks is probably down to, oh, I would guess maybe less than 10 pieces a year. Afghanistan, maybe they go out 2 or 3 times, so 20 pieces a year. And what gets substituted is a bunch of guys who are not in Afghanistan or Iraq and haven't been for at least days, and that's if they just got off the plane, but more likely weeks or months or years. And so, particularly in terms of the particulars of what's news, what's new, what's now, what's happening, none of the participants in this discussion know what the heck they're talking about. Instead, they're rehearsing the generic concepts that were true when they were last there or when they last gave concerted research effort to it. But it's not news, and it's not a substitute for news. It is news whiz. CNN and, rather Fox and MSNBC aren't news channels anymore, they're politics channels. And they're pretty frank about this. There are a couple of hours of the day when they fill in with news that isn't politics, but really they're politics channels. And so what they substitute for reports based on facts and observation from the scene is not just out of date, out of time, out of place blather, but self-interested blather by politicians or their spinmeisters or their wannabe next spinmeisters, all of whom have an interest in telling you a tale, but it has got nothing to do with what's real and what's really out there. So that the kinds of de-educating, disenfranchising, disempowering, fake news that Americans have almost no choice but to watch is hollowing out the American democratic politics in the same way that the American economy has been hollowed out, with both ends advancing and the middle being all but eradicated over the last 30 years. By the way, that story was hardly ever reported in the American news media. The antecedents of the crash in 2007 were there to be seen and reported in 2006 and 5 and 4. They were not. There's a bias against telling bad news because people don't want to hear it. And you'll get lower ratings if you try and tell bad news. But it's our mission to tell bad news, if it's true. We've abandoned that mission in favor of commoditizing our product. Now, the other thing to be said is, in addition to being the worst of times, it's in some ways the best of times. Video has become the most universal language ever in human history. 1.8 billion people speak English. That's the most used and understood spoken written language in the world. More people speak Mandarin Chinese as a first language, but almost nobody statistically speaks it as a second language. Almost everybody who speaks a second language, that second language is English. So, bulks it up, 1.8 billion English speakers. 2 billion computers in use, 2 billion television sets in use. By next year, 1 billion smartphones in use. People use them to communicate how? By video. People are becoming the masters of video. And the only thing wrong with it is video on the internet, you never know where it's coming from or who it's coming from or what its true intent is. And of course, the only answer to that problem is to have reporters on the ground who can compare what the bloggers or the amateur videoists are putting out with what they know to be there. But they're not there. And so we're trapped with YouTube video, which is ritually preceded by, we don't know anything about it. We're going to show you this video, but we don't know whether it's true. We don't know who shot it. We don't know any of the circumstances about it, but here it is. News whiz.
Thank you, Dave. Well, there is certainly no doubt that we have entered into a new era, one that does rely very heavily on social media as a means of communication. I'm sure that those of you who are familiar with Arab Spring know that video via smartphones, via Facebook, played a huge part in that uprising earlier this year. Putting together everything that you've heard so far, I'd like to address the panel and ask them to discuss just for a little bit of time before I open it up to the audience. With the good news and the bad news that has been presented, what is the direction that we go in and what can we do? Is there anything that can be done to reverse the trend that has started and to rein in the use of social media video so that it becomes a viable source of news?
I'm a little slow on the social media. I don't rely on Facebook or Twitter for my news. I have a Facebook account. I have a little bit of optimism about where journalism and broadcast journalism and internet journalism are going, because the demand for news is as strong as ever, or stronger. And once the industry or industries figure out how to deliver it in an economic way that still can pay the salaries of reporters on the ground, the public around the world is clamoring for information about what's going on. So the demand has not diminished. It's just the economics that are going through this crazy transition. But I want to ask Dave a question, if I could.
Absolutely.
I'm with you on the value of video. I was in the print world for a dozen years before I got into television. And it was, once I got into television, it was so liberating, because video shows you so much more than a reporter's written article about somebody's personality or about the look of a location or the mood at an event. It's very easy to convey a lot of reality through television. All you have to do is aim the camera and make sure the microphone's turned on. Whereas in print, it takes the most talented and skillful writers to set a scene and convey character and nuance. Video was really exciting to me, and yet I find that in my own viewing habits, I learn more from the talk side of things than I do from the network nightly newscasts, which I stopped watching 5 years ago. I watched the PBS NewsHour, which has some video, but a lot of talk. And I watched Charlie Rose and learned things from all his high-level guests. How do you square those two things, that there's less video on some of the more intelligent, news-oriented programs out there?
Well, what you're watching is what you got, is the answer really to your question. About a year ago, I ran into a young diplomat from Bangladesh who had been in Washington for about 6 months. And so I asked him, well, what's been the biggest surprise to you about the United States? And he says, oh, the television news. And I said, what was so surprising? He says, it's so terrible. We have much better television news in Bangladesh. Now, you know, by almost every economic and social measure, Bangladesh is among the poorest and least favored nations on earth. He was not exaggerating. All over, what's really maddening about America's withdrawal from video news is that everywhere else on Earth, new video news channels are being born every month. And almost all of them operate in the old-fashioned way of actually sending camera crews and reporters to scenes and having them come back with packaged stories about it. And their audiences flock to this. And their audiences are learning about the world through this. And Americans do not have that opportunity. In Pakistan, there are 7 all-news channels. And although some of them do have a lot of panel and talk shows, all of them have more news reporting than the American models do today. That's 1 in English, that's 4 in Urdu, 1 in Pashto, 1 in Sindhi, and I forget what the other one would be. But 7 news channels for Pakistan. Better news in Bangladesh. Compare Al Jazeera English to CNN International, which is slightly newsier than CNN America. There's no comparison. Al Jazeera has twice as many people in twice as many places doing...
Can any of these people get Al Jazeera English?
Everybody can get Al Jazeera English on your internet, on your computer. There's a live stream that's always available 24/7. And in fact, this is part of why it's the best of times, because now almost every television news organization live streams or streams excerpts of its product. Almost all of the major newspapers now do video reporting and offer half a dozen newly prepared video reports a day. The internet is just chock full of video news. Now, yeah, a lot of it is politically tendentious, a lot of it is slanted and biased, but even that, you know, the difference between radio, which is the greatest writer's medium of them all because you get to see it and they don't, and your job is to write it so they can see it. But in prose, you are rehearsing arguments, you are making points. With video, you're showing the evidence. You are allowing your viewer to draw his or her own conclusions because you can show them the raw material of what is there. And if you've got a good camera person and a good producer with you, you are going to capture the right visual and auditory details that will translate in 3 minutes the reality, the complex reality of a particular place at a particular time. But if you don't have reporters around the world, and none of the American networks have now more than half a dozen reporters outside of the United States, and the 3 news channels do hardly any reporting outside of the United States, you're not going to have this material. And the versions of it that you are going to have, whether you get it from Reuters or from Syrian national television or from amateur opposition vidyasts on YouTube, you're not in any position to vouch for the accuracy of that video. Terrible situation.
Well, Dave, I just want to, as far as I'm concerned, this decline of video and the decline of quality in American news, there's all 2 forces coming together. The first is the profit motive. It used to be our news sources were largely run by people who weren't terribly interested in making money off them. Ted Turner ran CNN well for so many years because he didn't want to make money off it. He was doing it because he liked doing it. You know, the Grahams running the Washington Post, the Sulzbergs running the New York Times were not trying to make money off. They were losing money out and they were fine with it. Now, every news organization is trying to make money. In fact, I'd say the one organization in America that's not trying to make money is Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera is largely is not working on a profit motive. Maybe that's why they can do better. But if our organizations have a profit motive, they're going to be trying to get the best ratings with the least amount of money. And this is what we get for doing that. And second, I think we've got more democracy. We've got more democracy that people now have a choice about what they want to watch. It used to be, 50 years ago, if you're watching the news, all three TV networks, and there's only 3 of them, are showing the news broadcast at the exact same time. So darn it, if you're watching TV at that time, you're watching the news, whether you like it or not. Now, you've got a choice. And the choice people have made, by and large, say, boy, I'd rather watch people shouting at each other. It's gotten to the point where MSNBC on the weekends doesn't show news at all. They show prison documentaries because that's apparently what people want to see, and that's what passes for some form of news. So if this is a result of people having more choice about media, and that's something that's not going away, we're going to have 1 million channels before too long, and second, a profit motive, how can you possibly reverse that? And it's one thing to say, oh, it's terrible, but I think we need to be constructive here. Are you saying we just need more disinterested plutocrats who just who are okay with losing money on news and want to have a high quality product? Are we saying we need to have government come in and fund the news because we're actually interested in having a high quality product, the NJN for so many years? And it's one solution, but all the trends are working against that.
Well, one of the unreported stories of the last 25 years has been that the standard profit margin has doubled. That means that whereas 20 years ago, a well-run corporation making a 10% profit would be considered a model. Now, shareholders and investors want 20% or more. Well, where's that money coming out of? It's coming out of the product and the people who make it. This is class warfare. This is real class warfare. On top of that, as Dan said, a generation ago, or as Michael was saying, a generation ago, the media were controlled by people who made a deal not with the devil but with the angels. That they would run their companies with enough profit so that they could be rich people, but not as much product as the department store or the steel company, because they were a public service organization and they were in a separate category of the economy. And they were willing to make this deal because as proprietors of the local media, they were local celebrities, they were local influentials, they got to go a lot of exciting places and meet a lot of exciting people, and it was worth it to them to take a little bit less money in profit in order to have these other benefits. Almost all of those old ruling families have sold out now, and they've sold out essentially to the same hedge fund greed heads who, hollowed out the rest of the economy in an insane desire to reward themselves for short-term quasi-profits. Meanwhile, the product itself gets lamer and lamer because the product is really based on having people go out and look at things and report them and, bring them back to you. And if you can't afford to do that, and if you find cheaper ways to re-engineer that, like if you do send a reporter out to the field, he doesn't actually go and report from the field, but he stands at a live position, and every hour on the hour has a little conversation with the anchor back in New York or Atlanta. Now this literally means this person is chained to the live position. There was a big embarrassing foo-for-all in Libya, as you remember, where the CNN correspondent and a Fox correspondent got into a great shouting match in which the Fox correspondent said, "Why do you go to these events put on by the Gaddafi government? Don't you know they're just propaganda?" And the CNN guy says, "Why don't you ever leave your hotel room in live position? At least I can show my people the baloney that the Gaddafi government creates and tries to sell to its people, and there's something to be understood from that. You standing on the hotel balcony with the city skyline behind you doesn't tell anybody anything." But it's re-engineered the job of correspondent into live spouter.
There's another way in which the correspondent's role is changing or has changed, and that's what we call one-man bands. That's where it's mainly young people who have learned how to shoot and edit on MacBooks and go out. And I was working side by side with someone from FiOS 1 Today in Atlantic City. I had a camera person because I'm an old guy. She was shooting her own interviews, she would do the whole story by herself. I have trouble imagining that that doesn't cause some sacrifice in quality. What's your view?
Obviously, you know, just because a job can be done by one person doesn't mean it can be done well. And the various skills that the one-man bands are now performing, researcher, correspondent, producer, camera person, sound person, these are not all cognate skills. There are a lot of people who, you know, are good producers and good correspondents, but that doesn't make them good visually looking at things through a camera. And by the way, often it occurs on a story that the camera's got something very valuable to shoot, but while the cameraman is shooting that, the correspondent can walk away from the camera and go talk to 3 or 4 other people and actually learn something. The one-man band person's got no time for that. The one-man band person really has got only time to go and do the interview and chop it up and send it back, because chances are that one-man band is doing 3 or 4 other stories that day and doing them all as best they can, and that's terrible because they don't have enough time to actually report the story. Nobody has all of the skills to be a superb sound technician, videographer, producer, reporter, researcher. I mean, these are different skills, and so it's just degraded the product. But, you know, cheese whiz. Democracy says people will buy cheese whiz. Only if Kraft felt a real dedication to know we're a cheese food company, and so our cheese is going to have a certain quality, could they have fought off cheese whiz? Profit margin says go the whiz route, and television news is going to the whiz.